Hello and welcome to Human Biology. This is going to be a very fast-paced, very quick semester, but I'm hoping it will still be enjoyable and you'll end up with lots of newfound knowledge that you maybe were a little unsure of coming in. So our first chapter is kind of an intro chapter to human biology. In general, we're going to look at life and the science that surrounds it. It's sort of, I would compare it to a wrap-up or a summary of what you did in human biology in high school if you took that class. And then from this point on, after this chapter, we'll be going system by system through the human body. So this one will be a little bit of a catch-all, a little bit of everything from human biology and how we look at the study of life. So first and foremost, very important to understand that anything that is called a living thing has to have specific characteristics that it possesses, otherwise it can't be alive. And there are about 6 characteristics of life that we're going to introduce you to, and understand that those characteristics of life have to be present in any living thing. So whether it's a little amoeba, a little one-celled organism in pond water, or it's you as a human being, which is a multicellular trillion cell plus member of the Mammal Society, either way, we do have to possess those characteristics of life even at the cellular level. So something that's an amoeba is just as alive as you or I are as a couple trillion-celled organism. We're also, by the time we're done with this chapter, going to be able to understand how we organize the levels of hierarchy when it comes to the body, when it comes to living things in general. And we also want to be able to understand the taboo of the word evolution in terms of how it stands and how we got to know what we do know about the human body currently. So first and foremost, let's start with those 6 characteristics of life, right? So the study of biology, which most of you would have taken like a human biology somewhat class in high school, as I mentioned before, you probably had a day where your teacher brought in a little glass of pond water and gave everyone a drop on a microscope slide, and you kind of looked at it and thought, oh, how exciting is this? It's a drop of water with these little cells in them that really don't do much, right? But it's the easiest representation we can show you of what a living thing is, right? And what it has to possess. So first and foremost, we consider cells the base of life, because if it doesn't have a cell, it can't be considered something that is alive. So if it doesn't have a cell, it can't be living. So the controversy exists there with viruses, because technically viruses are unicellular organisms, but they don't possess a cell. They are a thing that uses you as a host to live off of. The reason, though, we sometimes count them as a living thing, even though they don't possess a cell, is because they can do the act of reproduction. Now, granted, they use you to reproduce themselves, but any other inanimate object, non-cellular in nature, can't reproduce. I mean, it'd be nice if I was almost out of paper at my printer and I went to put my coat on to run to Walmart, and lo and behold, while I left the room, my printer paper reproduced itself and I had a whole ream of paper. I mean, that'd be really cost effective too, but it doesn't happen, right? So viruses technically are the exception to the rule when it comes to cells. Now, even at the cellular level, we have to produce all 6 characteristics of life. So that little amoeba that we just talked about, it's a unicellular organism, right? It's one cell. That one cell has to have all 6 of these characteristics. Otherwise, it would not be called a living thing. So first and foremost, every single thing that we call a living thing, an organism, has to be organized. In other words, I like to use the analogy. If I have all the parts that I'm supposed to have, which I was born with, right? That's not enough. I have to have all the parts that I'm supposed to have, but I also have to have those parts in a very specific organizational pattern inside my body in order for my body to work correctly. So for instance, if I was born with a heart and a uterus, being a female, but my heart was born in my pelvic cavity, my uterus was placed in my chest cavity, I would have all the parts I'm supposed to have, but it's not going to be compatible for life, because if all the vessels that are supposed to hook up to my heart are now hooked up to my uterus, that doesn't exactly pump blood around my body. So that's what we mean by they have to be very precisely organized in a very specific fashion in order for everything to work appropriately. 2, we have to have the ability, even at the cellular level, to acquire materials and energy. Just like you and I at the organism level need to eat and drink in order to maintain life, something at the cellular level, like our cells, also need to be able to eat, drink, and excrete waste, just like we do at the organism level. If your cells can't acquire energy, which, by the way, energy in the body is 3 little letters that you've probably heard of before, ATP, right? So if we don't have those 3 little energy letters, even our cells can't eat. If our cells can't eat, they can't excrete energy, they can't excrete waste, they can't neutralize or metabolize things. So very, very important that what we bring into the body can be converted into ATP in order to acquire energy from it, right? And if we don't acquire energy, we don't really have energy to do anything, much less the things you think of like walking, running, jumping. Think of things like having your heartbeat, breathing, brain thinking, things like that. The problem with acquiring materials and energy is kind of tricky nowadays too, right? Because we go to this thing called the grocery store. And when we walk in the grocery store, we are under this false pretense that it's filled with food. And food gives us energy. And part of that is true, but not all of it nowadays, right? Because when we walk into the grocery store and we put things in our cart like fruit snacks, right? There's only 4 things that the body knows how to break down, which we'll get into detail with later on. But those 4 things in a nutshell are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, aka fats, and nucleic acids, none of which are found in a fruit snack, and many other foods like fruit snack at the grocery store. And so, 20 years ago, when you hear about somebody that lived on a farm, they go and have a huge breakfast, right? They have, eggs and bacon and toast and all these things. They got energy from their food and they went out and worked in the field for another 8 hours. I would venture to say most of us nowadays, when we eat what's so-called food, we actually feel like taking a nap after we eat, right? It doesn't give us energy. Third is homeostasis. We have to have homeostasis being actively maintained even at the cellular level in order to maintain life. If you're not familiar with the word homeostasis, homeostasis means maintaining sameness. There are very key things in your body, like your temperature, your blood pressure, your blood sugar, things like that, for example, that have to be maintained within a very specific range in order for you to not succumb to death, illness, or disease, right? So homeostasis, the attempt that our body makes to always try to maintain within a range, that is very, very crucial. 4, we have to respond to stimuli. So even at the cellular level, that is super important. I mean, it's important at the organism level. If I'm, walking down the street and there's a car driving directly at me, I need to respond to the stimulus that is, potentially life-threatening to me by moving out of the way of the oncoming vehicle. Just like that is true at the organism level, very true to respond to stimuli at the cellular level. If the internal body temperature becomes too hot or too cold, or we are introduced to infection and it turns the temperature of our body up to fever or chills or things like that, those are things that we have to be able to respond to. If we feel that we're too cold on the inside of our body, how does your body have to respond? By making goosebumps and using little muscles around your hair follicles called erector pili muscles, which contract and help to try to increase the amount of heat in the body by making us shiver. If we're too hot, how does the body respond to that stimulus? It opens up our pores and allows us to sweat and excrete waste through those pores in an effort to dump excess heat from the body. 5th is reproduction and the potential for growth. Now, this is one that does differ between the organism level and the cellular level. At the organism level, do we have to reproduce to maintain life? No. If you never have children, you might be sad about that, right? But do you need to have children to reproduce yourself in order for you to maintain life? No. However, at the cellular level, it is absolutely critical that we have reproduction going on, because if we don't have reproduction at the cellular level, not only are we not growing and repairing, but if we have some sort of trauma or injury, that trauma and injury would not be repaired if we didn't have cellular reproduction taking place all of the time, right? So think about when you put a pair of jeans on, how many skin cells you slough off, right? You have to replace all those skin cells. If I break my arm, how do I make that arm go back together? That's all going to be done at the reproductive level. Now, as a species, yes, reproduction is very key, because if we don't reproduce as a species, then we become extinct and die off. but at an organism individual level, not a huge deal. And again, potential for growth is always key. I think sometimes as humans, we think, well, we only grow until we're about 20 years old and then our growth stops. Yes, longitudinal growth, so vertical growth stops, but we always have the potential to grow our bones in width every single day of our lives. We always have the potential to grow our skin or grow our muscle or grow our fat. And 6, have an evolutionary history. We can trace back the evolution of man. We can trace back the evolution of a dog or a cat. We have to have a scientific evolution pattern in order to see how we've adapted to changes in not only our society, but our ecosystem over the last hundreds of years, thousands of years in some cases, to see how we've shifted to make a better version of one particular organism. So how has the human being evolved to become the best version of itself that we see nowadays, right? Like, for instance, just take something little. Like if you live in a house that's older than, let's say, 1920, your ceiling heights are very different than modern day houses, right? Modern day houses have much higher ceilings, not because we're now 8 or 10 feet tall, but we are much taller than we used to be as a species when compared to 150 years ago. Our feet are bigger in size when compared to 150 years ago. So those things have evolved and changed for various reasons. And whatever those reasons may be, it's a product of natural selection. So we've picked the best characteristics and traits to carry forward in generations of our species, for example. All right, so as we look at the organization part of life, so the first one where it says life needs organization, there are lots of different ways that we can organize things, including the body, and we're going to look at the body's levels of organization first. So first and foremost, I want you to kind of imagine a ladder when we talk about this, and we're going to start on the lowest rung of the ladder, the lowest level of organization, and we're going to climb rung by rung up to the top of the ladder. The ladder as a whole is considered the organism. So we could think of, in our analogy, the ladder is the human being. But what are all the pieces and parts in levels of organization that make you up as a whole human being? So first and foremost, there are tons and tons, millions and trillions of atoms that make you up. Now, certainly we can't see atoms with the naked eye, but we can see things, microscopically speaking, that atoms make up. So when atoms form groups of things together, when they get together and form a group, they form little clusters called molecules. And molecules, we definitely can see things like H2O, water, right? Or hydrochloric acid that lines our stomach, for example. When we have molecules, or you could also call atoms forming chemicals, chemicals is appropriate as the lowest rung of our ladder. When we have chemicals that get together and form like groups for similar purposes, we're going to call a group of chemicals that work for a like purpose or like function a cell. Every single cell in your body is made up of hundreds of thousands of chemicals. And it is very crucial that we understand that, because when I teach anatomy class, sometimes my students are always like, why do we have to relearn a little bit of chemistry in anatomy class? It has nothing to do with anatomy, but it has everything to do with anatomy, right? Because anatomy is the tangible parts of your body. But when you take an anatomy class, you usually take what's called anatomy and physiology. Physiology is the study of function, so how your body is supposed to work. Well, how your body is supposed to work is basically several 100,000 different chemical reactions that are constantly occurring all of the time. So if you don't understand how chemicals work, how are you going to understand the functions of the body? It's great that I know where my liver is, but if I have no idea what my liver does for a living, I'm not quite an expert. So chemicals are lowest rung of the ladder, form cells. Remember, you need to have at least one cell to be called a living thing. And most of the organisms that we're going to talk about for our short 8 weeks together are going to be human organisms, which they are multicellular organisms, right? They are made up of trillions of cells in some cases. Now, when cells get together to form a group that functions for a like purpose, they form the next highest rung in the ladder, which are tissues. And there are 4 kinds of tissue in the human body. Those 4 kinds of tissue are going to be things like muscle And of course, skin, your integumentary system, as it's called, your epithelial tissue, and your nervous tissue, which is found in your brain and spinal cord, and connective tissue, which a lot of people think when they hear the word connective tissue, they think bones or tendons and ligaments, right, which are definitely a form of connective tissue. But connective tissue also includes things like your bones, your fat, your things like cartilage, right? Your liquids like blood and lymph. Those are all examples of connective tissue. So one of those 4 types of tissue, again, muscle tissue, epithelial, aka skin tissue, connective tissue, and of course, nervous tissue, all of the parts of our body have to be made up of those kinds of tissue. Those are the only 4 kinds of tissue we can be made up from. So when I combine at least 2 of those 4 kinds of tissue, I form the next highest rung in the ladder, which is an organ. And certainly you can name organs off the top of your head like pancreas or heart or kidneys, right? But again, the key to an organ is it has at least 2 of the 4 kinds of tissue. That being said, most of my organs will have all 4 kinds of tissue in them. Like, for instance, let's take my heart. My heart is a huge, giant muscle, essentially, right? We know it's a muscle because it contracts. It goes, generically speaking, lub-dub, lub-dub. Well, if it contracts, it has to have muscle tissue. So there's one of the 4. When my heart contracts and goes lub-dub, lub-dub, it's anchored to my chest wall. Well, anything that holds something in place is going to be connective tissue. So there's my 2 of the 4 so far. And when my heart goes lub-dub, lub-dub, and it's held in place and anchored by that piece of connective tissue, on the inside of my heart are 4 chambers, 4 spaces, and anything hollow on the inside of the body is lined with skin. So each of those 4 chambers of my heart are lined with epithelial tissue. So there's 3 of the 4 tissue types. And then last but not least, there are definitely tons of nerves innervating my heart muscle, because if I said, hey, let's have a pop quiz right now, what would your heart do? It would start to beat really, 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 really fast, right? Because it responds to nervous tissue. And so great example of an organ that contains all 4 kinds of tissue. But remember, it has to have at least 2 of the 4. Now, going up the next rung of my ladder, organs, when they group together in a group that is similar sometimes in location, but more so similar in function, that they're all working to do one specific task. Like, for instance, all of the organs that help me to breathe, or all of the organs that help me to digest my food. We're going to call those organ systems. And there are approximately 10 organ systems in the body. And the reason I say approximately 10 is not because I don't know how many we don't have. It's because every book kind of slices and dices the body a little different. For instance, some books will say you have a cardiovascular system and a lymphatic system, and other books will put them together and say you have a circulatory system that includes both of those systems under one umbrella. So that's what I mean by approximately 10. We'll talk about those this semester. And then the highest rung on our ladder, if you will, is an organism. So again, an organism is a collection of somebody who has all of the organs and organ systems and tissues and all the pieces and parts that they're supposed to have, but, there's always a but, it has to be precisely arranged. Again, if we don't have a precise arrangement of those organ systems and tissues and cells and things like that, it's like having all the parts for your car laying on the garage floor. We have everything we need. If it's up to me to put that car back together, whenever you find where it is I put the ignition, I doubt it's going to go vroom when you put your key in the ignition. So that's why organization, going back to that, is super key. Now, above organisms, we have 3 levels of organization as well: species, population, and community. So species means a group of interbreeding organisms. So, for instance, all of us as human beings are a species. All of the dogs in Brown County are a species. All of the cats in Brown County are a separate species, right? So they all interbreed among each other in their own species. When we use the word population, that's the members of one species in a particular area. So if I took all humans in Northeast Wisconsin, that would be a population. If I took all the dogs in Northeast Wisconsin, that would be a population. A community then is interacting population. So if I took all living things in Northeast Wisconsin, so anything that's alive, plants, dogs, cats, ferrets, raccoons, humans, you name it, that would be a community. All right, so different species, different populations, but we're all in one geographical region. So as we've already determined, life is organized. And those communities form ecosystems. And ecosystems is when you have communities of various populations interacting with your physical environment. And it's a very delicate balance between populations and your environment. Look at some of the changes that have occurred when we change our environment too drastically and what suffers as a consequence from that. One that comes to the top of my head is, if any of you are familiar in Green Bay where Cabela's is, right? Where Cabela's is built, right by the highway there, used to be a wetland, and it was a preserved wetland. Like, you were not allowed to fish or hunt there. There was lots of wildlife species, lots of deer, and it was a very protected area. It was very protected until somebody wanted to throw a lot of money at it and build a store that Green Bay really wanted. And then it was like, oh yeah, well, EPA rights, what are those? We don't care about those. Yeah, sure, build your building. So that protected wetland that had many, many different species and lots of deer was suddenly pushed out of the way and filled in with dirt, and they built Cabela's. Now, the problem with that is I happen to live in a neighborhood just across the highway from Cabela's, a very busy neighborhood, lots of traffic, cars, people, not a lot of wildlife, until they built Cabela's. And now all the deer and all the ducks and all the turkeys that used to be in that wetlife suddenly are in the middle of my neighborhood. I mean, you don't normally think of going down a residential busy street and worrying about running out, having deer run out in front of you until you almost hit them. But that is exactly what happened. We have turkey like they're going out of style now. They used to be on the other side of the highway in their little preserved wetland. Well, because we changed the ecosystem there and altered the environment that those animals were used to drastically, they had to change in order to survive. Last but not least, and highest rung of the level of organization would be something we call the biosphere. And so those are if you took all of the Earth's ecosystem, rainforests, deserts, wetlands, marshes, mountains, all of that into consideration, functioning as the Earth as a whole, that's our biosphere. So those are the words we have to start to get used to. So remember, life requires energy. And again, energy you can just kind of define generically as the capacity to do work, but we have to acquire materials in order to eat and change into energy. Again, energy being 3 letters, ATP, and that's true of any other mammal you can think of. And we have to obtain that energy from what we eat. Now, again, that's where the crux is nowadays, because is it possible to get energy from what we eat if what we're eating is called food, but it doesn't really fit into the things that we were hardwired in order to digest into food? For instance, eating an apple is easy for your body to acquire energy from it, right? But if I go and eat, let's say, a can of SpaghettiOs, it's debatable how much usable nutrients are in a can of SpaghettiOs that my body, is there enough to extract those nutrients and make them and convert them into energy? So food should give us energy. It's debatable whether or not that happens nowadays. So another thing that we have to have is a metabolism system. Now, when I say the word metabolism, for the girls in the class, we always think thyroid gland, right? Most people know our thyroid gland is our metabolism gland. And the metabolism in the body is a tricky thing, but basically speaking, if we have proper working metabolism, our food is easily converted into energy and burned for useful processes in the body. If our thyroid gland does not work properly, then our metabolism is being slowed down, and I could be eating 2 saltines and a Diet Coke and gain weight, even though calorically speaking, that shouldn't be enough to give me energy that would create an excess and make me gain weight. So I always say, please, if I'm going to get a disease, please give me hyperthyroidism, right? Those are the people that eat your double cheeseburgers for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they're like a size 0. And you're like, really? How is that possible? So metabolism is key, because at the cellular level, not just the organism level, we have to take in raw ingredients, be able to convert them into ATP, and use them to function and do all the life-saving functions the body needs: breathing, eating, sleeping, excreting, things like that. Ultimate source for energy in the world, in our ecosystems, or in our biosphere, if you will, is the sun. The sun provides most of the energy necessary for us to sustain life not in a direct but an indirect way. For instance, the sun produces the process of photosynthesis, which is what plants and algae and bacteria use to make nutrients into usable material, energy, right? And then they give off energy that humans need to take in, and they feed the animals that eat on the plants, and that we eat the animals that fed on the plants, right? It's just this long chain process. So photosynthesis is a key process. If we were in an area with no sun, this would not be accomplished, because not only would the things that directly use photosynthesis die, like our plants and our algae and our bacteria, but then the animals that eat the plants and the algae and the bacteria would die. And then the things that eat the animals that eat the plants and algae and bacteria would die. And it would just be going on this long stretch, right? And we start to see problems with some of these things as we encounter global warming. And you see places like Antarctica that are slowly kind of melting away. And we look at polar bears being found in strange places because they're having to travel further and further away from their normal ecosystems in order to find food, right? In order to find potential energy nutrients. All right, so again, here's that word I mentioned before, homeostasis. Again, it means maintaining sameness. So it's set points in our body that have to be maintained in a very narrow range. So again, things like temperature, blood sugar, your blood pressure. Give you an example. Most people, if I said, what is normal body temperature? Most people would say 98.6, right? You know it's 98.6, but it's actually 98.6 plus or minus 1 degree. So as long as your body temperature right this second is between 97.6 and 99.6, you are within a homeostatic range for temperature. So technically you don't have a fever until your temperature is 99.7, and you don't have hypothermia until your temperature is below 97.6, right? And that's where we start calling it pathologies at that point, whether you have a fever or you have hypothermia, because now you've fallen out of homeostatic range. Just like blood sugar, right? We need to maintain blood sugar between 70 and 110 deciliters per milligram. And those kind of things are where if we have too low a blood sugar or too high a blood sugar, we get diagnosed with diseases like diabetes. Now, if we just go out of range temporarily, that's one thing. But if we can't maintain that normal range, that's where we talk about problems with homeostasis. So homeostasis would be impossible to maintain if you didn't have the ability to respond to stimuli. So stimuli are what excite the body into thinking, oh, something's changing, we have to respond to the change. Like, for instance, if I walk outside and it was 70 degrees yesterday and today it's 17 degrees, which is exactly what happened about 2 weeks ago, right? When we had that huge shift in temperature in a 24-hour period. I went outside to get the mail dressed like I did yesterday when it was 70 degrees. Today it's 17. I walk outside and I'm like, holy cow, it's cold out. Because all of my external stimuli on my skin, my erector pili muscles, my goosebumps, shot up as soon as it felt the cold. And that told my brain, brr, I'm cold, put a layer on me, right? Put a coat on, put something on that makes it easier for us to maintain homeostasis. Just like if you are working out and your body temperature inside from all the contraction of your muscles is heating up and heating up and heating up. Well, obviously your body responds to that stimulus, because if it doesn't, you're going to overheat and pass out. But it usually responds to the stimulus by opening up your pores and causing you to sweat, which releases excess heat from inside the body. So those are just two examples. All right, so again, reproduction at the cellular level is crucial. At the organism level, not crucial. At the species level, crucial, right? So at one extreme and the other, very crucial. At the organism level, whether you personally reproduce yourself, not a big deal. But we have to reproduce at the species level and the cellular level in order to prolong or make our genetics go forward, right? Because what we're reproducing is our genes, our DNA, our chromosomes, our genetic sequencing. And growth is also very important, because what if parts of my body grew from newborn on, but parts of my body, like my heart and my kidneys, never grew? Well, you can't have an adult-sized body with a small heart that's only capable of pumping blood for an 8-year-old, right? And you're a 25-year-old kind of thing. So growth is very important, not just at the organism level, but at the cellular level, because if the cells don't grow, you don't grow. If the cells don't grow, your organs don't grow, your tissues don't grow, your bones don't grow, your muscles don't grow, etc. Development is all the changes that occur from fertilization until death. So we kind of divide the development period into three, right? Childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Those are the three developmental periods. And again, development is possible in all three of those periods. Granted, we see the most developmental changes in the body as a whole take place from childhood to adolescence. Adolescence, we certainly see physical changes, but also a lot of mental changes that occur. And adulthood, we kind of have a little bit of development, right? You can always learn new skills and new vocabulary, languages, things like that. So you still have development occurring, but there is a slight decline to development once we reach the age, medically speaking, of about 55. All right, so what determines what our genes are, right? What are genes? What are mutations? What is DNA? So DNA is another three-letter word, deoxyribonucleic acid. It's its official term. I'm certain that you've heard of it before. And basically the DNA is the stuff that makes you you. It's the blueprint for what you turned out like, right? The fact that you have blue eyes and brown hair and you're 5'5" versus 6 feet tall, those are all things that were programmed or hardwired into your genetic information that you receive from mom and dad, and that's your DNA. It has all the hereditary information that basically is the blueprints that direct the instructions as you're being built of how tall you're going to be and what color hair you're going to have and what color eyes you're going to have and how coordinated you are, things like that. Your genes are the short segments that contain your DNA, right? Your chromosomes contain DNA. Chromosomes are part of your genes, and your genes are specific for every single trait. So I have a gene that determines my hair color. I have a gene that determines my eye color. I have a gene that determines my height. I have a gene that determines my overall metabolism abilities, right? So genes are the packages that contain the DNA, if you will. And mutations is when you have variations in those genes. Now, usually the word mutation conjures up a bad connotation, right? Like a bad change in a gene sequence. But sometimes they can be beneficial mutations, right? Sometimes nature creates an oops that results in a mutation, but it ends up being beneficial for human society instead of bad. Sometimes they're bad, right? But I think what some people don't understand is that we all have genetic mutations. If you were born, you think, whew, I made it. I don't have any mutations. But you might have one green eye and one blue eye. Technically, that's a mutation. Is it life-threatening by any means? Of course not. You pick a colored contact, decide if you like blue or green better, and go with it. Same thing with your hair color. If my genes coded for the fact that I have blonde hair, but I really wanted red hair, well, I go to the salon and I fix that mutation as far as I'm concerned. But mutations, again, sometimes can be bad. They can be influenced by chemical exposure or different things that we're exposed to during pregnancy. Like, for instance, if mom were to be exposed to radiation during pregnancy, there's certain medications we can't be exposed to during pregnancy that can affect development of your baby and cause mutations. And sometimes they just spontaneously occur. Sometimes they just happen. Like for somebody who is advanced maternal age, over the age of 33, and they have a baby, right? They can have a mutated gene that causes a genetic mutation like Down syndrome, which again, is that a bad thing? Not at all. Ask anyone who has a Down syndrome child. They're awesome little creatures. But in terms of the genetic sequence, was it a mutation? Yes. So you've certainly heard the term evolution. Evolution is basically the changes we see to a population over a period of time. So like I discussed, why are humans as a species taller than we used to be? Why do we have bigger feet than we used to be? Those are changes that we can track over time in our particular population. Natural selection is responsible for a vast majority of evolution. Why evolution occurs is due to natural selection. Your body, your genetic makeup is always selecting genes that are more qualified, if you will, for the population that you exist in. For instance, if you have all bunny rabbits as a species in the United States, if they're all exactly the same, how are they all going to exist in different ecosystems? What if I have bunnies, and there certainly are bunnies, that live in the Arizona desert? right? If they have as much fur as the bunnies that live in Maine in winters where it gets below -40 outside, how are those two species, they're the same species, how are those two populations of species that live in different ecosystems both going to be survived at their content ecosystem, right? Well, you'll see bunnies in the desert have very thin fur, if not no fur. There are furless species of rabbits that you will see in the desert that have been naturally selected over evolution to live in the population that they do because they are an Arizona rabbit. It gets hundreds of degrees, right? It gets to like 120 in the summer in the desert. And so if they had the full head of fur that we see on bunnies that grow in Maine, right, for example, they would surely die of heat stroke, right? So evolution has naturally selected over time for their fur to become thinner and thinner and thinner, albeit sometimes non-existent, where bunnies in Maine are very similar to a lot of animals up there where they get very, very thick coats of fur as the winter months progress, and then they thin the fur, they lose their winter fur as they go into summer months. And that, of course, is a great example of adaptation, right? Over time, a population has individuals with advantageous varieties or variants. So as we see what becomes more successful in that population, the genes are manipulated to be more like that advantageous variant. Now, you might say, well, how do the genes know that, right? It's also part of human, like I can only talk from the human aspect, but where you sometimes have short women and they are very attracted to very tall men, like 6 feet plus, right? And they're 5'2", and you're like, well, what's the attraction there, right? Well, there's something in their genes that are pulling them to the taller species because genetically speaking, taller varieties tend to have more advantageous variants. And so some women, unbeknownst to them, are attracted to taller men for that very reason. It's an adaptation. It's advantageous to have these taller genes, so to speak. That's just one example. There's tons of examples. And you don't have to be a short person to like a tall person, right? It could be the opposite. It could be, no, I only like people that are 5'2". But we're just talking about how natural selection occurs. All right. So those are the things that we should be able to explain coming out of that first 15 slides, right? So check your progress. Make sure you can list the 6 basic characteristics of life. Summarize the levels of biological organization, right? We had chemicals create cells, cells create tissues, tissues create organs, organs create systems, systems create you create populations, populations turn into communities, communities turn into ecosystems, etc. Right? All right, so moving on from that, we're going to go into humans are related to other animals. And this is where it'll seem like a review of human biology from your high school biology kind of class. So all life is divided or classified into one of 3 domains. You're either a bacteria, an archaea, or a eukarya, right? And so we're going to fall in the eukarya standpoint. Bacteria certainly fall in the bacteria standpoint. And a lot of people are like, what the heck are archaea? So we're going to go into that. So bacteria and archaea are very basic evolutionary components. So they are in their own category made by types of cells called prokaryotes. And prokaryotes are single-celled organisms that lack cells, nucleuses. They do not have a nucleus, which if you remember anything from cells, the nucleus, if a cell has one, is the most important part of that cell because it's literally the part of the cell that's telling every other part of the cell what to do, how to do it, and how often to do it, right? So very, very primitive bacteria and archaea are prokaryotes versus everything else that doesn't fall into bacteria or archaea, which are going to be our eukaryotes, which is what we are part of. They belong to a family that are eukaryotic cells, and they definitely contain a nucleus. So some eukaryotes are single-celled, like, for instance, our amoeba that we found in pond water, but a lot of them, like ourselves, like your cats, your dogs, and us, are multicellular. So we're going to, after this chapter, of course, for most of the semester, we're only going to look at eukaryotes, but we want to know the difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. So those are my evolutionary relationships, right? You have bacteria, archaea, and then all of the rest, which are eukaryotes. And of course, eukaryotes are going to make up a vast majority of those domains. But again, there are lots of bacteria and there are lots of archaea. So looking at the domain Eukarya, which is what we're part of, we are divided into 4 kingdoms, if you will. And of those 4 kingdoms, there are 6 supergroups, right? So the 4 kingdoms are here: plants, which is the Plantae kingdom; fungi, which are the fungi kingdom. So think things like mushrooms, right? Animals, which is the Animalia kingdom, of course; and protists, which are the Protista kingdom. We belong to the animal kingdom. I know you don't think of ourselves as Animalia, but we are one with mammals. So this group of eukaryotic organisms belongs to all different supergroups, but these are our 4 primary kingdoms. Now, if we look at the classification of archaea and bacteria, you're going to see that prokaryotic cells in the archaea delineation are going to have various shapes. Remember, they don't have a nucleus because they're considered prokaryotic. They adapt to very extreme environments. So these are things that you're going to find, remember, they're usually unicellular, and we're going to find them in areas where no other life is present because it's too harsh of a condition for life to exist. So those things that you find living in Antarctica or in the Dead Sea, where the salt content is not compatible with a lot of other life forms, those are going to be things that are places that you're going to find archaea. Extreme sulfuric lakes that if we would touch them, we would have our skin melt off, but you have small microbes living in those places. Those are going to be archaea. So they absorb or they chemosynthesize their food. So they make food from chemicals that are present. And basically they have unique chemical characteristics to survive in the very harsh environments that we find them in. Now, bacteria, abundant, right? We have tons of bacteria, and they are prokaryotic as well. So they're usually unicellular, no nucleus present. They can sometimes exist in pretty harsh environments, but for the most part, they, like homeostasis. So one of the reasons, for instance, when I'm infected with bacteria, that my body reacts by turning up my body temperature and making me have a fever is because bacteria don't like high temperatures. It lowers the oxygen levels in my body, and my body needs oxygen just like they at the cellular level need oxygen in order to reproduce themselves. So it starves bacteria from oxygen and it helps to kill off bacteria. So the problem with bacteria, though, is they are very adaptable. They can very much adapt to their environment. And this is the continuous problem we see nowadays. If you watch the news at all, other than just having it on as background noise sometimes, we are literally facing a crisis. I'll call it a huge medical crisis that no one's talking about. And that antibiotic resistance is becoming very much a thing. There are things that we easily used to treat with antibiotics that are no longer responsive to antibiotics that we're throwing at them. We have a lot of bacteria that have become antibiotic resistant. And this is a problem. And this is something that was foreshadowed by Fleming, who discovered penicillin back in the day and said, the more you use this stuff, the less effective it's going to become. Basically, the more times you expose bacteria to antibiotics, the more they go, oh, okay, well, you gave us that last time. I know what that does. I know how to not do that. So they're very smart and they very much adapt. And so, you know, now something as simple as one of the most common STDs in the country is gonorrhea and chlamydia. Well, now we used to treat gonorrhea and chlamydia easily with antibiotics. Nowadays, we have 2 noted strains in the last 3 years of gonorrhea that have become antibiotic resistant, which means, interpreting that, we can't treat those 2 strains of gonorrhea with antibiotics, and you basically have them for life like you would herpes or AIDS or HIV or something like that. So it's scary in some cases how adaptable bacteria can be. Now, in terms of Protista and Plantae communities or kingdoms, right now we're in the eukaryotic side of things. Of course, your Protista is probably going to be the one you're less familiar with. It is characterized, like I said, as a eukaryote, so it has a nucleus in most cases. These are going to be mostly water organisms, so things like algae, slime, protozoa, water mold, right? The algae that sits on the surface of water. Those are all going to be in the kingdom Protista, and they are photosynthetic, like our Plantae community. And so they absorb nutrients from the sunlight and they convert that into usable energy. So if you think about it, most of the protista have to be in superficial layers of the water in order to absorb sunlight, right? The deeper you go, the further you are away from sunlight, and therefore they wouldn't be able to photosynthesize their food. Now, of course, plants are the classic photosynthesis absorbers, right? They are also going to absorb sunlight and convert it into energy and give off carbon dioxide or give off energy for us in the form of oxygen, and they need our carbon dioxide to help kind of complete that cycle. They can be multicellular. Of course, plants can be large organized pieces. Not everything is as simple as a little, violet or something, but of course there's lots and lots and lots of types of things that fall under either protista or the plantae kingdom. Now, in terms of fungi are going to be obvious things like mushrooms, but also yeast, like somebody having a yeast infection. It's called Candida albicans. It's funny because the word candy almost appears in it. And if you have an opportunistic fungal infection, it's very much driven by an overabundance of sugar in the body. So if you have a high sugar diet, you're going to see fungal infections that creep in. You're going to get continuous yeast infections and things like that. But of course, ringworm, mold, things like that, those are all going to fall under the fungal community. Fungi are unique because they don't use photosynthesis, they don't chemosynthesize their food, and they certainly don't eat other food chain particles as part of it like we do. They absorb whatever is nearby them. So they have this decomposing method that they can literally decompose anything into nutrients and grow from that. Think about where a mushroom grows in the forest. There's no sunlight there. It's very dark. It might be very wet. Not a lot of other vegetation can survive in those conditions, but there's mushrooms flourishing away. And of course, then there's our kingdom, the animal kingdom. We tend to be multicellular organisms, though there are a few unicellular organisms, but anything from water sponges and earthworms to mammals like ourselves, all of it falls under the Animalia kingdom. So in kingdom Animalia, most of the animals we find there are invertebrates, which means they don't have structural support like a vertebra. Now, of course, there are some vertebrates, and those are going to be stuff like us and your dog and birds and things like that. So most animals that are invertebrates lack skeletal support. Those are going to be things like your earthworms and your mollusks, snails, things like that. Vertebrates, of course, have a vertebral column, which most of the things that you are most familiar with are going to be vertebrate in nature. And vertebrates with hair or fur or mammary glands are called mammals. So we are a subsidiary of the animal kingdom. So we're animal, vertebrate, mammalia, right? That would be our classification and subdivision, if you will. So anything that has mammary glands that breastfeed their young, if they have hair or fur, which we do, we don't have fur, but we have hair, right? So we fall under the mammalia category. And mammals by nature will always be part of the vertebrate community or kingdom. So if we look at humans, humans are considered primate mammals. We share that, of course, with primates, which are apes and gorillas. And most closely, we are related to apes as much as we'd like to think we're not similar to them, we are. They are the only other mammal that has opposable thumbs like ourselves that help us to grasp and hold things, unlike other humans or other mammals like our dog, for example, who has one tendon that moves their paw up and down. They can't individually grasp things. We have much more highly developed brains. We are bipedal, so we are completely on an upright stance, and we have creative language skills. So not only can we learn a language, period, we can learn multiple languages or even nonverbal languages like sign language, for example. And because of our opposable thumb situation, we have the unique ability to use a wide variety of tools like hammers and forks and cups and things like that other animals couldn't ever come up with, even if we gave them the tools, couldn't use due to the fact that they don't have those opposable thumbs. So again, our evolutionary history speaks to apes. We evolved from apes, according to science. So humans have a cultural heritage, and culture is a word that like everyone knows what it means, but no one knows how to say, oh, this is what culture means, right? So culture by definition says activities and items passed down from one generation to the next. culture could be a system of beliefs. It could be a system of values, morality, skills. Like, for instance, if your dad plays the guitar and he handed down to you musical skills. If somebody in your family is a very good artist, if somebody in your family is a politician, if somebody in your family has a very high moral fortitude, maybe they're very Christian, those kinds of things that we inherit from traditions that our family has passed down based on beliefs or values, those are going to be what we call culture. And so the more culture you have, obviously, the more natural selections that play there too, because we want people that have high amounts of culture. We don't want somebody that just has, blinders on and goes through life not absorbing anything from their environments or from beliefs of other people of the same species, good, bad, or indifferent. So humans are members of the biosphere. Again, biosphere meaning all the ecosystems that make up Earth. The biosphere spans the surface of the Earth all the way down to the soil and the seas. And we are unique because we are one of the few mammals that are adaptable to most places or most ecosystems in the biosphere. So in other words, we could adapt to living in the rainforest. We could adapt to living in Antarctica. We could adapt to living in the desert. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have non-man-made adaptations for that. Like, for instance, the clothing that we would choose to wear in each of those environments, or rainproof shoes or things like that. But we have the ability to choose those things and adapt. Whereas if we took a hairless rabbit and put it in Antarctica, it doesn't have the skills to grow hair. It's not part of its genes, and it would die as a result of its ecosystem. So again, biosphere, you should know the definition, which we did, culture, and explain the difference between eukarya and kingdom Animalia. All right, so next we want to look at science as a process here. And so first thing we want to do with science as a process is start with an observation. We have to look at what our eyes are telling us. Sometimes I always say if it's the easiest part of something, we always skip that part, or we always forget about that part. But observation is the formal way of watching the natural world. By looking with our eyes, and I mean really looking, like taking time out and looking at the surroundings around you, you are taking in all the different sights and sounds in front of you. You can smell different things. You can see different things. You hear different things, right? Like some of you can tell which bird is chirping outside, not just that it's a bird chirping outside, by listening to the song of that particular bird. And you're able to do that because you've made observations throughout your life of what a bird sounds like, what this particular kind of bird makes the noise, etc. And so sometimes we need help to observe things we can't see with the naked eye, things like microscopes, right? Like bacteria and viruses, and all the knowledge we've gotten about those comes from accessory tools like a microscope. And of course, then we take theories that the microscope has helped us see, like, oh, why do these always have these? And formulate through research, through formal research, what types of bacteria are good, which type of bacteria are bad, which viruses cause this particular illness, etc. So observations always start from a simple question, basically, right? I could be, fishing and say, why do only walleye bite on this type of bait, for example? And that's my observation. And from that observation, I could make that into a whole process and, really turn that into some sort of research project and think, well, what's in the diet of walleye, and what's in the environment, and do they like cold water or warm water? And we could go down a rabbit hole and create a whole research project out of it. The next thing we do after we come up with a question, right? Like, why does this happen? Or why does this bird only chirp in the morning? Or whatever our question is, whatever our observation that posed the question, then we want to develop a hypothesis. And a hypothesis at the end of the day is an educated guess. It's a possible explanation that you think is responsible for the observation that you made. It could be right, it could be wrong, right? But it's going to be loosely based on what you think is the reason behind what you saw or heard or smelled or listened to, right? And then there's something called inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is when someone uses creative thinking to combine facts into a cohesive whole. And sometimes inductive reasoning is more creative than we'd like it to be, right? There's creative thinking and then there's creative hypothesis. And you want hypotheses to be as close as they can possibly be to what probably is the answer, right? We don't want to go like oh, well, I think that, elephants have babies that they have because they're pregnant for 4 years. They're not pregnant for 4 years, right? But they're just kind of making up a story as they go along. Well, obviously, we can't make a prediction that's loosely based off inductive reasoning alone, right? We have to have facts and observations behind the inductive reasoning to form an educated hypothesis. So when we do research then on the hypothesis that we're saying, I think this is what's going to happen when we, show these kind of cells to this kind of environment. I think that they're all going to die. I think they're all going to get bigger, or whatever our hypothesis is going to be. So once we've gotten a hypothesis, an educated guess of what we think is the cause behind the action or the observation, then we have to test our hypothesis. And so we use what's called deductive reasoning to test the hypothesis. If this happens, then I think this is what's going to be the outcome. So experiments are designed with variables that we can manipulate in order to determine, one, if the hypothesis is in fact true, and two, if it's not true, why isn't it true, right? What is the real thing that happens, right? So experiments are designed with experimental variables and dependent variables. Now, experimental variables are the things that you're going to manipulate by, let's say, I want to see if my tomato plant grows when I put it in hot environments, nice homeostatic 70 degrees, or where we have a couple nights in the 50s. Which environment do tomato plants grow best in? So, of course, I'm going to have one tomato plant that I keep at a consistent 70 degrees, and I'm going to expose one to intermittent very high temperatures and one intermittently to very low temperatures. So those are going to be my two experimental variables that I'm manipulating, and the plant in the middle, my dependent variable, I'm going to keep consistently at 70 degrees no matter what, right? So a test group and a control group, they're the same thing for the most part, but they're two different pieces of the same group. So control groups, we control exactly what they're exposed to, and test groups are exposed to the independent variables, the variables that are being experimentally manipulated. Like your control group, right? They will always get sugar pills, for example, let's just say. So model organisms, those are what are used in our experiment to test the hypotheses. Mice is a very common one we use, of course, in the medical world, but they could be anything. They could be insects or people. There are human trials for things, right? But anything that's participating in a trial, whether signed up voluntarily or not, are model organisms. So once we've tested the hypothesis, then it's time to collect all the data that we received from doing our experiment with those experimental and dependent variables and analyzing the data. So the data has to be presented in a variety of formats. For instance, this is the part that you really want to know when you look at another person's study or research project. Because, for instance, what if, and this is a very true outcome of a very real experiment, I once read an experiment that said soda is not the cause, as once originally thought, for the diabetes epidemic, right? And I thought, wow, everything in every other research article I pointed to has implied that growing consumption of soda, which increases sugar consumption, is very much at least paralleling the epidemic of diabetes. This one is saying the complete opposite. So how do we have like 10 studies saying, yeah, soda is a big trigger for diabetes, and this one's saying, heck no, it has nothing to do with diabetes. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, until I read who published the study, and that was Coca-Cola Corporation. Well, how are they going to produce a very inductive, talk about inductive reasoning, very creative reasoning for why sugar and soda wasn't to at least majorly blamed for the diabetes epidemic? Because they have a vested interest in selling Coca-Cola, right? So you always got to look at, too, who's funding the study, what manipulants are going in behind the scenes of that study. But data is where your bread and butter is. The data doesn't lie. You can manipulate data for sure. You can have badly manipulated studies, but in a good controlled study, the data doesn't lie, and graphs are going to be a very useful way to see the data in common language, right? To say this is more than this or less than this, or this produced less desirable outcomes. You can't look at a table and not understand what it says, right? So for instance, variation in blood cholesterol levels, right? If we had patients who started out at, let's say, 150 cholesterol, And then we put them on a trial for 4 weeks. By the end of the 4 weeks, everyone's cholesterol had gone down from 225 to 175. Like, for instance, a statin study. This would be like a cholesterol drug study. So those are what we look at for the graphs and the data, and we usually plot it out in a similar manner. Statistics are used to interpret data. They're not everything, but for the most part, they're pretty reliable. Statistical data will always have a standard area or error, or what you call standard deviation. So it's always going to be 1.5, let's say, plus or minus 2 or 3. And the higher the standard deviation, the less reliable the study was, right? Because what if I said that correct blood pressure should be 120/80 plus or minus 40? Right? That means that everyone from 120 to 160 and 80 to 120 is considered normal. That would be not good, right? Because some people would have very high blood pressure even though they'd be called normal in that standard deviation. So the lower the standard deviation, the more statistically correct that study was, I guess we'd say. Statistical significance is determined to evaluate the probability that results are due to chance or some other experimental variable. So you want statistical significance to be low, because the lower that number, the less likely it is just from chance that we ended up with the results from the study that we did. The higher that number, then the results are going to be more likely due to chance, like some other variable that was present that we didn't have control over, for example. And all of our studies have to be published in scientific journals, scientific publications like American Medical Journal, right? Or American Association of Medical Journal, pancreatic renal sufficiency journals, things like that. You don't include things like Wikipedia or WebMD as a scientific publication, because especially Wikipedia, I mean, obviously anyone can manipulate that. WebMD, you'd like to think, is a pretty reliable source. However, there are lots of people who sponsor, pages like WebMD. So of course, if a particular sponsor has a vested monetary interest in something, then, and let's say I'm a Tylenol company, and you're going to publish a journal article that says Tylenol is horrible for you, then obviously that's not going to go over well with me, your biggest sponsor, right? So you have to take some of those kind of internet pages with a grain of salt, depending on who is sponsoring them. If they have multiple companies that sponsor them, of course, they have vested interest there. So statistically, they might not be the most accurate data producing substances. So developing a conclusion is something you have to remain open to. It may go with your hypothesis. It may go completely against your hypothesis. And either one is okay, but you have to be able to openly and non-judgmentally look at what the data is telling you, what the variables told you, be open to looking at the process. Was the study created in a controlled manner, in a scientific manner? It wasn't swayed by the opinions or the person's funding the study, kind of thing. And again, the conclusion of one experiment can lead to the hypothesis of another experiment. So if this experiment determined Tylenol is fine to use during pregnancy, then somebody else might run a study that is Tylenol really okay to run with pregnancy, kind of thing. So sometimes that's the process. It's this dive down a rabbit hole. When one person poses a question and finds what they think is an answer, somebody may question your answer and come up with another experiment to kind of prove or disprove your hypothesis. So scientific theory, accepted explanations for how the world works, right? So there's lots of scientific theories. For instance, we thought that an accepted explanation for how the world works is that the world is round. If you've noticed, there's a new trend with a lot of flat earth people. Since the birth of social media, people are starting to claim, oh, the earth is flat. Well, I thought we already had a scientific theory that accepted it was round. But again, that's totally their prerogative. And like I said, one conclusion creates another experiment. Like, is the earth really round? Now they want to run an experiment the other way, which that's what the world runs off of. So the cell theory, for example, is a widely accepted scientific theory that says all organisms are made of cells. You cannot be called an organism if you don't have at least one cell. You can't be called a living thing if you don't have a cell. Unless you're a virus, which again muddies the water because they don't have a cell, but they are able to reproduce. A law, a scientific law, or a scientific principle is accepted by an overwhelming majority of scientists. Evolution would be that. think about the background, the history of evolution. It was pretty murky for a pretty long time. I mean, people used to ban it from being taught in school, and it was considered against Christianity and all these things. But scientifically, we accept evolution, that we accept that we came from apes at some point in life, right? Or that, certain frogs are a great example of evolution because they're still sort of an evolutionary animal. They can go from water, amphibious nature, to living on dry land. They can go from being a tadpole to an amphibian like a frog. So how do you explain that other than evolution? Now, an example of a controlled study would be if my hypothesis, so my educated guess is antibiotic B is better than antibiotic A for this particular infection. So let's say for urinary tract infections. So if we wanted to create a study to disprove or prove my hypothesis, we would first need a control group. So the control group are subjects with ulcers that receive a placebo, a pill that contains no medication. So they don't know that though, right? They think they're getting a medication that's going to help their ulcer. Control group will receive the placebo though, and then we'll have the experimental group that receive antibiotics, right? And half the experimental group will receive antibiotic A, and half the experimental group will receive antibiotic B. Now, we have to go in with them all having the same condition. So in this case, when we say ulcers, they have ulcers not related to stress. They would have had a gastric ulcer and had it tested or biopsied for a particular type of bacteria that can cause it. And so they all tested positive for the bacteria, which is called H. pylori. And so now we're going to give a third of the control group antibiotic A who have H. pylori, a third of the experimental group who have H. pylori bacteria ulcers, we're going to give them antibiotic B. And then the third, the control group, they also have H. pylori ulcers, but we're giving them a sugar pill. And so a double-blind study means neither the doctors or the patients know which part of the study they're in. So again, they don't know if they're the control group. They don't know if they're getting antibiotic A or B. It's all a mystery to everyone involved, not just the subjects in the experiment. And the conclusion is antibiotic B did in fact have a better response rate for healing the ulcer caused by H. pylori in those patients that were given the actual antibiotic B. And of course, the end, then we find out who had what. So again, controlled studies are key, and that they have to be double blind, because as much as we'd like to think we don't have any stereotypes, we love everyone, we believe all things are good, blah, 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 we have stereotypic nature as a human being. So double blind always works best because you don't have any inherent outside affiliations or outside stereotypical views that are coming to play, like, no, I never prescribe A, I know B is better, or vice versa kind of thing, because that will really sway how you present the study. So the last thing we have to talk about is, of course, science and the challenges that we face in society, distinguishing between when it's right to use science versus technology, and look at some of the challenges that we're going to be facing as technology keeps increasing. So, of course, science has been around for hundreds of years. It's basically a systemic approach of how we acquire knowledge about the world around us. I mean, I literally sometimes think, how the heck 300-400 years ago did they didn't understand something as simple as having an infection, and people would die of getting a cut on their finger, having it get infected. They died. They had no antibiotics. So we know it's Fleming, but theoretically, who decided to go in their fridge, get some mold that was growing on something, and thought, hey, I can make medicine out of this? Right? Like, that's crazy. How did people discover things like antibiotics? How did people discover, as recent as the 1880s through the 1920s, people used to get what was called colloidal goiter. So they'd get this huge enlargement of their thyroid gland, and it looked like they swallowed a bullfrog, right? It was absolutely huge, and it hindered how they talked, and it was very painful. And lo and behold, somebody discovered the link between iodine and the thyroid. That the thyroid needs iodine in order to function, and if you don't have enough iodine, you got this swelling in your goiter. And not everyone was getting it. So what was the difference in diet between person A and person B? Well, then we came up with this lovely conclusion that yes, you do need iodine for your thyroid, and somebody created something that you all have in your medicine cabinet, in your kitchen cabinets right now, called iodized salt. right? So who would have thought just adding a little iodine to your salt, and Lord knows we all have enough salt in our lives, would cure goiter, right? Would keep this from happening to your thyroid gland. So science is a great way to acquire this knowledge. It's been tried and true and tested, and sometimes what we've always believed is turned on its end because technology comes out with something new and disproves something we've all thought to be true for 100 years. So it's constantly changing, it's constantly evolving. And technology is taking scientific knowledge and basically using technology to further the knowledge that we have, or further our ability to use the knowledge that we have. So climate change, of course, is a huge thing. You'd have to live under a rock not to have heard the term before. It basically is something we believe to be caused by the excess of chemical recycling of carbon, right? As we have more and more of a diverse population, an ever-expanding population, the Earth simply can't support the population that it does currently. And because we are increasing in size, we are increasing transportation and building and taking over natural preserves and things like that, we are altering the ecosystems as we speak. And this is creating a phenomenon of global warming, right? We talk about things like our carbon footprint, like how much do you contribute to global warming? As much as global warming may seem welcome at sometimes, like who doesn't want a 70-degree day in Wisconsin in January? I mean, I loved it, but is that normal? No. And when you think about people have built their entire careers based on normal weather patterns in the populations that they live. Look at what happened in the northern parts of our state this year where there was no snow, and they rely heavily on a snowmobile season for the winter in order to support their businesses and their bars and their restaurants. And there was nothing of the sort this year. There was no fishing tournaments and no, cold hunting season and all those things. And that, while it affects the environment, of course, it also impacts our economies, very much so, right? It'll be interesting to see how many businesses are still open for business come this summer season because they may not have survived the winter season in terms of global warming. So scientific consensus is that climate change and global warming are a very real thing. They're causing very real significant changes in the Earth's ecosystems. And I think we have definitely witnessed that this year here in Northeast Wisconsin. So continuing on for just the last little bit of chapter 1 here, we're going to look at the terms biodiversity and habitat loss. So these are things that you hear about in the news, like rhinoceroses are going extinct, for example. So technology, as we use just the word, of course we all know what this word means, but in a strict definition sense related to science, it's the application of scientific knowledge to human interest. So in other words, we're manipulating the science, we're manipulating the technology to fit what we want to better do in science, whether it be treatments for cancer or realizing certain genes and what they may predispose somebody to. Biodiversity is the total number of relative abundance of species and the variability of their genes. So in other words, all the limitless potential that exists if those genes were crossed in particular manners, right? So like, for instance, no two humans, unless they're identical twins, of course, look exactly alike. And that's due to all the variability of the mixing of genes, right? We call America the melting pot for many, many different reasons, because you look at all the different genes that are incorporated into people in this country, and it's amazing. It's thrilling to watch. No two people are the same. Sometimes you can't quite put your finger on where certain genes have come from, what nationality that person might be, because it's a mixture. It's a beautiful thing. And it is also influenced, if you will, by the different ecosystems that those people live in. So certain genes are naturally selected in more frequency in certain climates. So for instance, people who live in deserts, hopefully the genes selected there would tend to be, more metabolism, thinner build, more muscles that they can hold on to more water, because fat doesn't hold on to water very well, but muscles do. and therefore they have more durability against dehydration in those areas. Versus if you live in northern climates where you get lots of snow and frigid temperatures, we're going to naturally select for genes that tend to make people a little bit fluffier, because you need some of that insulating fat in order to survive appropriately in those areas. So believe it or not, your ecosystems do play a role in the natural selection process for your genes. Of course, they're not the major derivative, your genes themselves are, but that certainly helps to sway natural selection in those areas. Of course, the word extinction just means death of a species, or the threat of death of a species. And there are many, 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 many species on the extinction list, including things like certain panda bears and rhinoceroses and hippos and elephants, of course, because of the trade for their tusks. So biologists are at this point very alarmed at the rate of extinction of certain species. We're seeing similar rates edging up to where it was for like the dinosaur era of extinction, which is scary because that's going to wipe out a huge part of certain animal kingdom populations. And of course, one of the biggest things we're seeing that is one, human nature, right, and the killing of these animals senselessly, but also the ecosystem changes. We've drastically, evaporated half of the rainforest, for example. Well, think of all the animals that we've displaced and changed their ecosystem forevermore. So those kind of things also factor into the extinction process. Now, in terms of emerging and re-emerging diseases, this is something we're going to talk about too. If you've taken Human Biology 217, Health and or Human Disease and Society, this is where that class will play off of and go into great detail with. But emerging diseases are those that are relatively new. We're starting to see them surge for the first time, like COVID-19, right? COVID-19 is a derivative of the coronavirus. Coronavirus has been around for decades, but in terms of the mutations that caused the coronavirus to mutate into COVID-19 and the SARS virus and HSN1, the bird flu, right? That was very popular. Avian flu is bird flu. We had the, what was the other one we had? The swine flu. That was, if you've lived in my era about 10 years ago, that was a big thing, the swine flu, H1N1. So those kind of things, as they pop up, they're called emerging because they're relatively new. We don't know a lot about them. And of course, they create an epidemic, in some cases like COVID, a pandemic, because we can't figure out fast enough how to contain them. Versus re-emerging diseases are things that have been around forever that we are successful in tamping down the rates of, but then for some reason they just swell up. Like for instance, mumps, right? All of us since the 70s have been vaccinated with an MMR vaccination as a child, which stands for measles, mumps, and rubella. So the vast population in the United States is vaccinated against mumps. But about 4 years ago, we had a huge breakthrough resurgence of mumps, and people who had been vaccinated were suddenly getting mumps. And so we know that bacteria and viruses are able to mutate themselves and form different strains that may not then cohesively be tamped down, if you will, by certain vaccinations. Ebola is a big one, right? Anthrax, right? We were worried about Ebola and anthrax. About 10 years ago, there was a huge resurgence with that, and they are sometimes used for biological warfare. So some come from globalization, some increased exposure to certain animals, like you don't worry about getting rabies until you're bit by a squirrel or a chipmunk or something that is more common to carry that disease. But other ones come from vectors that mutate and change, like malaria, for example, right? So that can be carried by the vector of a mosquito, and depending on the person's genes that it lands within, it may successfully initiate a malaria strain. So definitely different things, but emerging and re-emerging, just because we have old familiar things that repopulate and re-emerge doesn't mean we automatically know how to treat them, because again, they have the potential to mutate and turn into different strains of the same disease, and therefore old tricks or old medicine doesn't always work on those re-emergent strains. All right,